be talking about she's going to be talking about Abigail Adams. And if you're like me, you like to hear about the first ladies, even if maybe it wasn't someone that you would have voted for. But since none of us were alive back then, we don't have to tell anyone. So, anyway, sit back and enjoy. And I know Janet will answer questions if you have any. So, take it away, Janet.
Okay. If you do have questions, do you all know how to raise your hand? In the anyone who does not know how to raise their hand? Okay. Um, I first gave this presentation a year or two ago at the University of Dayton's Osher Lifelong Learning Center. They were doing a seminar on presidents' wives, and they found suckers among the people who attend to research and give the presentations. And of course, I was one of those suckers. So I said, sure, I'll do one, but I want to do Abigail Adams. And lo and behold, I got Abigail Adams. I was thrilled. Um, so I'm going to share my screen and um, okay, all right. Okay, I hope everyone can see this. Um, oh, okay. Um, when the title of when was the title of First Lady coined? What was her role? And has that role changed over the years? The term was first used by Emily Briggs in 1870 in reference to Martha Washington in describing the etiquette in the presidential household. Later, Mary Clemmer Ames used the term to describe Lucy Hayes. Since that time, it has become the accepted title for the president's wife. Before that, she was referred to as Mrs. her husband's name or Mrs. President. Martha Washington realized when George was selected as the first president that she would have the role of hostess in the ceremonial parts of her husband's new job. Early in the history of the Republic, hostess was the major role of the president's wife. But as the president's closest confidant, she was also his sounding board and possible advisor. The early wives had to establish the role of president's wife as somewhere between a commoner and a queen. In a new democracy that was afraid of monarchy and strong executive authority, she had to fit into the common ideas of women's behavior at the time without seeming too regal. But yet she had to be regal enough to entertain foreign dignitaries and give weight and prestige to her husband's office. She had to work at providing a place where the president could feel at home and yet provide a place where the president could do the job of running the new government and interacting with representatives of foreign governments. Luckily, four of the six first wives had run large diplomatic households abroad before their husbands became president. As the president's wife, she also had to put up with criticism from the press. Abigail Adams was criticized for being too outspoken on national affairs. Dolly Madison for being too casual and entertaining. Elizabeth Monroe for being too elite. Margaret Taylor for not being elite enough. Mary Lincoln for extravagance, and Lucy Hayes for being prudish. And more modern first ladies are seen as having too much influence on their husbands' careers. The wives were supposed to work within the framework of the expectations for women at the time. Yet many of them also challenged the status of women and broadened the accepted expectations. The role of First Lady has changed over the years. They are still the primary hostess for the president. They plan official dinners and entertain visiting dignitaries and their wives. They are surrogates for the president at ceremonial functions when he cannot attend. They are often unofficial advisors to their husbands. They participate in campaigns, work on presidential projects, and represent their husbands' views. Today, presidents make use of their wives' talents. Eleanor Roosevelt traveled and reported her observations to her husband. Lady Bird Johnson worked on several Gate Society programs. Rosalind Carter attended cabinet meetings and testified before a Senate Committee on Mental Health Care. And Hillary Clinton headed up Bill Clinton's drive to reform health care. They have extended our understanding of how women can be involved in government beyond voting and holding office. When we think of the term First Lady today, we see the president's wife standing next to him at ceremonial and campaign events, greeting guests at the White House functions, representing the president on certain occasions, and working on her own projects, giving a prestigious face to what she considers an important cause. Abigail Adams was an early indication of how powerful a force her husband's life and presidency of First Lady could be. Have you ever known a woman that was a force of nature? That was Abigail Adams. Described as dynamic, outspoken, obstinate, stubborn, independent, and aggressive, she was known to give advice to her husband, children, her sisters, and friends, and expected it to be followed. She remembered slights and criticisms of her family and did not forgive the critic. She no longer corresponded with both Thomas Jefferson and Mercy Otis Warren when each of them criticized her husband and his policies. She was upset that women had a secondary role in society. In a letter to her sister Elizabeth, she said, "I shall never consent to have our sex considered in an inferior point of light." She felt that both men and women brought different strengths to a marriage, that their talents and interests should complement each other, and that marriage should be seen as a partnership of equals. Born in 1744, she was the second child of four, three girls and one boy, born to Elizabeth Quincy and Reverend William Smith of Weymouth, Massachusetts. In addition to giving their children a strong faith in God, the Smiths made sure their children were well educated. Though their son was sent to school, the three girls were educated at home, where they had access to large classical library and could listen to the discussion their parents had with visitors. Remember, it was unusual to give girls an education at this time. In addition to learning to read and write, Elizabeth Quincy Smith taught the girls the skills they would need to manage a household, such as cooking, cleaning, spinning, gardening, managing servants, maintaining a fire in the fireplace, scouring pots and pans, raising chickens and other livestock, slaughtering them, elementary carpentry, and splitting logs. They also learned to be good Christian women. They learned compassion, family affection, caring for the sick and dying, and thrift. Abigail became an avid letter writer. The reason we know so much about her is the letters she exchanged with her sisters, husband, children, and friends. The letters reveal her sense of humor. She could give as good as she got. Events in the local community, what family members were doing, her concern for the safety of traveling family members, and her views on politics. Abigail met John Adams in 1759. Adams was a lawyer and had a good practice as well as a farm. He liked Abigail because she made him laugh. They began to exchange letters when he rode the legal circuit in Massachusetts and was practicing law in Boston. In October of 1764, they married. The ceremony was conducted by her father. The couple moved to John's farm near Braintree, now called Quincy, Massachusetts. Abigail fulfilled the role expected of women at the time: marry, produce children, manage the household, educate the children, and help her husband fulfill his goals and ambitions. and John was very ambitious. He wanted to leave his mark in Massachusetts history, but he was also doubtful he could do so and was prone to bouts of melancholy. Abigail provided the steady, even keel to his mood swings. She was his sounding board on important issues for the colony and read and commented on the essays he wrote for local newspapers. John knew she would give him strength. In a 1764 letter, he said, "You will polish and refine my sentiments of life and manners, banish all unsocial and ill-natured particles in my composition, and form me to that happy temper that can reconcile a quick discernment with a perfect candor." As he increasingly became involved in the politics of Massachusetts and the problems the colonies were having with England, he discussed his thoughts with her, and they made most decisions together. These include his run for the Massachusetts legislature in 1770, his defense of the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, and his trip to Philadelphia in 1774 for the Continental Congress. The last decision was critical, though they did not know it at the time. Except for brief visits home, they would be apart for 10 years. Abigail would be a single mother raising 4 children during wartime. John made infrequent trips to Braintree. He visited in late 1776 and again in late 1777. He used these trips to practice law and get more cash for the family. He praised her care of the farm and claimed she managed it better than he did. During the 1776 trip, he left Abigail pregnant with their last child, the one that was stillborn. In 1779, John was named part of, wait a minute. I think I skipped a page. My bad. Okay, Abigail had 6 pregnancies. Abigail Jr., called Nabby, was born in 1765. John Quincy in 1767, Susanna in 1768, Charles in 1770, Thomas Boylston in 1772, and Elizabeth in 1777. Susanna only lived 14 months, and Elizabeth was stillborn. John and Abigail were loving but demanding parents. They were ambitious for their children and urged them to be successful in virtue. For men, that meant public service, and for women, that meant in the domestic area. All the children felt the pressure. Nabby responded by turning inward and was the opposite personality to her mother. Her marriage to William Smith was not a happy one. The boys got some relief from the pressure when they were sent to board with Abigail's sister Elizabeth and her husband, who ran a school in New Hampshire. John Quincy especially was held to a high standard. He was given the impression that anything less than the highest position in government would mark him as a failure. This caused John Quincy to have an inferiority complex and be somewhat unsure of himself. However, he did fulfill their expectations and became president. Charles and Thomas, however, would have problems with alcoholism. John and Abigail had homes in Boston and Braintree. They moved back and forth between them during the first 10 years of their marriage. When John went to Philadelphia, Abigail and the children settled in Braintree. Abigail wrote frequently, keeping John informed of her care of the farm, local events, the war in Boston, and the children's education. He remarked that her letters kept him in good humor. She told him of the shortage of farmhands, high wartime prices, the shortage of sugar, coffee, and pins. She passed on stories about mobs of women attacking merchants who were hoarding supplies and taking the supplies from their warehouses. She discussed the raising of food, the attacks of marauders, how the women learned to make molasses from corn stalks and turn that into rum. She made decisions on everything from paint colors in the house to the treatment of ailing horses and other farm animals, and what and when to plant and harvest. During the war, the family lived frugally. When short of cash, she went through John's books and found people who owed him money and tried to collect it. No one in the Continental Congress was getting paid a salary. She also rented out the house in Boston. She reported on British troops in Boston, local men training for the militia, soldiers coming and staying in the house, melting her pewter for bullets, and demanding food and drink. Abigail could watch the fighting in Boston from a local hilltop. And she and John Quincy watched the Battle of Bunker Hill and the burning of Charlestown together. She also cared for sick soldiers in the house. Dysentery and smallpox were two diseases that were running rampant through the area at the time. Dysentery would claim Abigail's mother. Abigail suffered through a bout as well. Abigail and John had decided to get the family inoculated against smallpox in 1776. When the Declaration of Independence was signed, she was caring for her sick children and not feeling well herself. Abigail continually washed the house down with vinegar. Abigail's family believed in the cause of independency. When the pastor at her church prayed for reconciliation with Britain, Abigail refused to join in, saying the British were not worthy of being associated with the colonies and that she hoped the Almighty would knock them down. Her letters reveal she wanted independence. In one of these letters in the spring of 1776, she wrote the famous Remember the Ladies passage, hoping to get Congress to protect women from being abused by their husbands. At this time, women were legally children. When they married, their property became the property of their husbands, and he could do with it as he pleased. They could not vote, hold public office, serve on juries, testify in courts, or sign contracts. Their wages were given to their husbands. If they, heaven forbid, divorced their husbands, the children belonged to the husband. John thought she was joking about Remember the Ladies and wrote back that women were already in charge and such laws would, quote, subject men to the despotism of the petticoat, unquote. Abigail was not amused. John had to send an apologetic letter to mollify her. He said he agreed with her, but his main concern was to get Congress to agree on independence. Abigail probably realized what John did not, that the arguments he was sending to Parliament had implications that undermine all systems of absolute power and called into question slavery, property qualifications for voting, as well as rights for women and minorities. Later, when she and John wrote to each other about the new government being formed under the Articles of Confederation, Abigail stressed education for women as they were the first teachers of their children. John agreed with this sentiment, saying that history showed that behind successful men were knowledgeable women. Abigail continued with this advice throughout her life. In 1778, she wrote to a niece to move beyond the kitchen and drawing room, to which some men wished to confine women, and to improve her mind. John made infrequent trips to Braintree. He visited in late 1776 and again in late 1777. He used these trips to practice law and get more cash for the family. He praised her care of the farm and claimed she managed it better than he did. During the 1776 trip, he left Abigail pregnant with their last child, the one that was stillborn. In 1779, John was named part of the commission to write the peace treaty with England in Paris. He left Abigail behind, but brought John Quincy with him. While living in France, he sent her laces, ribbons, fans, handkerchiefs, and tumblers for her to sell and make extra funds for the family. Following the signing of the treaty, he asked Abigail to join him in France, which she did in 1784. She took Nabby with her and sent Charles and Thomas to her sister Elizabeth's boarding school. She put her sister Mary and Mary's husband, Richard Cranch, who lived in Braintree, in charge of their properties. Mary kept Abigail informed of everything that went on in the area. On the trips to France, Abigail thought the ship filthy. She organized the sailors and had them scrub the ship from bow to stern. She also went into the galley and gave the cook lessons on how to make the meals tastier. Did I mention she was a force of nature? The house Abigail cared for in Braintree had 7 rooms. The house she moved into in Paris had 30 rooms. That house is pictured in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. The other pictures are of the French court and of John and other diplomats working on various documents and treaties. Um, Abigail felt challenged to keep up a 30-room mansion. She thought the French servants were lazy and too particular about what tasks they performed. She wrote to her sisters that she preferred the simpler lifestyle of New England to the extravagance around her in France. In the spring of 1784, John was appointed the ambassador to England. In 1785, the family moved to London, where they would stay for 3 years. John and Abigail grew closer together during their time in Europe. They were in each other's company constantly and were each other's refuge from the criticism of the British press and the resentment of the British aristocracy. London was an unfriendly environment for the first U.S. ambassador. The city and the court of St. James were not as lavish as the French court, but there were many events to attend and parties they had to host. As ambassador's wife, Abigail was not permitted to do housework. In London, she managed 8 servants. Because there were so few strenuous activities, she gained weight. Diplomatic wives were expected to accompany their husbands to all ceremonial and special events. They were considered a team. Luckily, Abigail and John were already a partnership. Abigail had more of a public role than she had before and did not have to hide her intelligence. Other important events occurred while they lived in London. It was in London that Nabby met and married William Smith, her father's secretary, and had her first child. John and Abigail were in Europe while the Constitution was written. John wrote a treatise to be published in the US calling for a stronger central government. Abigail advised against publishing it, saying the public would call him a monarchist. John didn't listen, published it anyway, and found Abigail correct in her judgment. In 1788, John was replaced as ambassador and planned to return to Braintree, now called Quincy. Abigail wrote to a friend that, quote, retiring to my own little farm, feeding my poultry and improving my garden has more charms for me than residing at the court of St. James, where I seldom meet with characters so inoffensive as my hens and chickens or minds so well improved as my garden. Unquote. Before returning, John asked the Cranches to purchase and a new and larger house for him and Abigail in Quincy. It became known as Braintree. They had barely settled into their new home when John won election as Vice President of the United States. They now packed up the house and moved to New York City, the new capital. Abigail was happy with the move as it put her closer to Nabby and her grandchildren, who also lived in New York City. Before leaving Quincy, Abigail again arranged for the care of the farms in their absence. Both continued a wide correspondence with friends and family back home. From these letters, we know their views on the important events during the Washington administration. They favored Hamilton's financial plan for the country and neutrality in terms of the French Revolution. As the vice president's wife, Abigail was a major hostess in the new capital. She and Martha Washington spent a lot of time together. They made calls on 15 to 20 wives of senators, representatives, and diplomats per week. They also received calls from other government wives. Abigail hosted Monday evening receptions and formal dinners on Wednesday. These events were appropriately formal for foreign dignitaries, but they were also open to all well-dressed visitors, which lent a sense of democracy to the occasions. She was so busy that she lost all the weight she put on in Europe by 1792. Abigail had begun to have health problems in London, and these continued to worsen as time went on. Rheumatoid arthritis ran in Abigail's family. When she had an arthritic attack, her joints were swollen and she felt waves of pain. Occasionally, she was paralyzed. By the end of John's first term as vice president, she had to decline about half of the invitations she received. She would spend most of John's second term as vice president in Quincy at Peacefield. John continually wrote to her to come back to the capital. She did come when he had to move from Philadelphia as the capital of the country had changed. She did not like Philadelphia as much as New York. When Washington announced his retirement from public service, John also thought about retirement. Abigail did not want him to put his name forward for president, as she feared the criticism that the family would receive if he was elected to the presidency, and because she knew he would talk too much about their views about her, and she knew she would talk too much about her views and cause problems for John because she thought it was time for both of them to retire. In the end, John decided to serve if he was elected. Abigail did not join John immediately in Philadelphia after his election. She stayed in Quincy to care for John's mother during her illness. When she joined him, she again took up the role of hostess and unofficial advisor. John also asked her to help him write semi-official letters. Abigail was correct that her outspokenness would get the couple into trouble with the press. The French Revolution was a huge issue for the new government. Abigail was opposed to the excesses she saw in it. She felt it was spreading licentiousness and atheism. After the French tried to extort money from the US government, Abigail spoke in favor of a war with France. She also argued in favor of the Alien and Sedition Act, which put limits on free speech, press, and immigration. John also agreed about the Alien and Sedition Act, which he signed, but he did not favor a war with France and was able to avoid it. As the president's wife, she rose at 5 a.m., dealt with her correspondence until 8, when she and John had breakfast together. She then spent several hours receiving visitors and making calls on other wives. She joined John at dinner at 3, where they entertained 8 to 10 guests. She hosted a state banquet once a week and evening social events twice a week. They spent time later reading, talking, and or writing letters. She had to bring her managerial skill to the job of president's wife. Inflation had reduced the buying power of the president's salary, and she needed to practice frugality in order to keep up with the ceremonial aspects of the job. Attacks of rheumatism kept her an invalid and confined for long periods of time. In 1799, Abigail suffered a severe rheumatoid arthritis attack and returned to Quincy, where she was bedridden for 3 months. John left Philadelphia to be with her. In response to criticism about conducting the government of the United States by letter from Quincy, he said she had given him priority during the war and cared for the farm and suffered through the death of a child alone. Now he was making her the priority. He returned to Philadelphia when she felt better. In 1800, the capital was moved to Washington, District of Columbia. John moved into the unfinished presidential house. He asked Abigail to return to help him with the move. Abigail had to make the unfinished house habitable. Plaster was still drying, staircases were unfinished. There was not enough wood to keep 12 fireplaces going to dry the paint. The roof leaked and the grounds were mud. Abigail commented that 2 New England workers could do more in a day than the 12 slaves who worked at a slow pace to do the landscaping. Congress was also stingy with the funding for the completion. John and Abigail had always opposed slavery. Abigail thought it went against Christ's precept to treat others as yourself. But the new capital was in the South, and the contractors used slave labor on the mansion. By 1800, the extended family was having problems. Charles' alcoholism was public knowledge. In the previous few years, he had lost a great deal of money he had been given to invest. He died in 1800. Nabby's husband was having financial problems. None of his schemes to make money worked. John could not get him a government job, but he did give him money to help temporarily. In 1800 was also an election year. John and Abigail were expected to lose the election to Jefferson, but the loss still hit Abigail hard and she suffered a bout of depression. She would return home in February of 1801. John would follow in March. He was much happier in his return to Quincy. Abigail spent her retirement in her favorite role, managing the household, family, relatives, and village. Since she had managed their public affairs so well after 1774, John told her to continue to manage the farms. The Peacefield staff, and Peacefield is the house that you see on the screen, consisted of John and Esther Bristler, who worked for the family for 30 years, Louisa Smith, Abigail's niece, and Phoebe Abdi, a free black servant. Soon they were joined by Sally, Charles's wife, and her 2 children. Nabby and her 3 children lived with her parents about 3 months every year. Thomas married a local girl and lived in the area with his 7 children. And John Quincy and his wife, Louisa Catherine, moved to nearby Boston. But due to his diplomatic assignments, 2 or 3 of their 5 children lived temporarily with their grandparents. Both Abigail and John worked on the farm when they were able. John in the fields and Abigail in the barn tending animals. Abigail frequently opened the house to the community on Sundays and entertained family and friends when she was able. During this time, Abigail grew closer to her sisters Mary in Quincy and Elizabeth in New Hampshire. About once a year, John and Abigail went to visit Elizabeth. Abigail was fearful of debt and constantly worried that they would be swindled. Therefore, she was very conservative with her investments. She had invested in government securities. These proved a good investment. When John sent letters asking people to buy land for him, she wrote immediately and told them not to be so fast with the purchases, to check it out and make sure the offer was legitimate and the property a good piece of land. By the time of retirement, the Adamses owned over 600 acres divided among three farms. At John's death in 1826, the farms were valued at $100,000. However, John's investments with the British investment firm were lost in 1803 when the company went under, and both of their investments with the Boston land speculator were lost when he went bankrupt. They went through some tough times with finances as a result of this. Abigail's main goal in her final years was to create a family legacy that would live long in the memory of future generations and to help Nabby and Louisa Catherine. Abigail had always given advice to others in her letters. This did not stop in her old age. Louisa Catherine was frequently reduced to tears as a result of letters telling her how to dress John Quincy for the weather in Washington, D.C., or a diplomatic posting, and to make sure that he had lunch or a snack with him when he was serving in the Senate. Temperamentally and emotionally, they were very different from each other, and it would take years for them to learn to respect each other. Nabby was another matter. Both parents and her brother John Quincy urged her to leave William Smith, but she would not. She would stay with her parents for 3 months a year, but always went back to her husband. In 1811, Nabby discovered a lump in her breast. She returned home to ask her parents for advice. They consulted with Benjamin Rush, the foremost doctor in New England, who told her to get a mastectomy, which she did. Remember, at this time, there were no anesthetics. She
Oh
was
boy.
tied to the bed, given a shot of whiskey and a piece of leather to bite on. Despite the operation, Nabby died 2 years later. Abigail would never fully recover from Nabby's death. In 1811, Abigail's sister Mary and her husband Richard Cranch died within days of each other. In 1815, Abigail's sister Elizabeth died. In 1816, Abigail wrote her will, splitting her gowns, jewelry, shawls, bed, blankets, and $4,000 among her children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren. She also divided 2 parcels of land that she owned between John Quincy and Thomas. Technically, the land was John's to dispose of, but neither she nor John thought it unusual that she would dispose of this land. During her final years, she continued to suffer bouts of rheumatism, sleeplessness, and various fevers. In October of 1818, she came down with typhus and possibly suffered a stroke. She died with John at her side on October 28th. She was 74. They had been married for 54 years. In speaking of his mother, John Quincy said, she had been cheerful but not frivolous. She had a profound but not obtuse sensibility, and she possessed neither gall nor guile. She relished politics, conversation, and nature. She had a delicate sense of propriety. In her eulogy, Louisa Catherine said, she was the guiding planet around which all revolved, performing their separate duties only by the impulse of her magnetic power. And John referred to Abigail as a dutiful wife and an intellectual equal, a lover and a friend, a heart and a mind. Any questions, comments, issues?
We took a trip a few years ago to Quincy, Mass. I don't
Mhm.
know if any of you have been there to the Adams property,
Yeah.
but the let's see the I'm trying to think. It is owned by the federal government, and you can take a tour. It was like a $5 tour. It was the best bargain tour we've ever taken, and you get to go through their homes. Um, Also, you get to go into this unbelievable library of John Quincy Adams. That is, when you think about the date, that he lived and the amount of books that he owned, it is beyond belief, really. Um, you saw her tomb there. Well, both of their tombs are part of the tour. Their tombs are in a basement area of a church in Quincy. And there we were, all lined up around the room right beside their tombs. So it's only 45 minutes out of Boston. So if any of you are in Boston, it's a quick trip to get to Quincy. It's a cute little town, and the tour is just the best.
I would agree. I took the tour.
Oh,
Well,
okay.
mine did not include the grave sites beneath the church.
Mhm.
But I do agree it is a wonderful place to visit and to walk around and to see their homes.
Yeah,
The
it's the National Park Service that
yes.
owns the properties. Mhm.
And John Quincy would move into Peacefield uh, and make that his primary home.
Mhm. Mhm.
Mhm.
Neat.
Anything surprising that you learned?
Yeah, what a micromanager she was. She did not hold back.
No, she didn't. Uh, they did suffer from they did suffer a lot of heartache. Um, the loss of one, two, let's see, one, two, three of their children. Four of their children, I'm sorry, Nabby died as well. Four of their children before their own deaths. That had to have been hard. Um, and they were in the house when, I mean, the Nabby's surgery was done in the home. So they were in the house while it was being done, both Abigail and John. Um,
without anesthetic.
without anesthetic. You need to remember, we're about 50 years before anesthetics are discovered. Um, so that had to have been incredibly painful.
Oh,
Um, yeah. And being the ambassador, the wife to the first ambassador to England after the revolution, they were snubbed, insulted, um, ignored. Um, it the treatment in England was just incredible. And they were very happy when John's 3 years were done and they could return home.
well, the 10 years of running the farm and the business and the family while he's gone is, you know, she clearly was an incredible businesswoman, incredible manager, in early. I mean, really early. So I can
Right.
see why your sense of I have to be an equal if I'm keeping the home fires burning and the land going and the kids raising while you're doing your public service. I mean, what an amount of public service she did.
Yes. And she was educating John Quincy at home. He was not sent to a boarding school. She was his first educator. Um, and he would become uh, an ambassador, a senator, a representative, as well as president. And in fact, after the presidency, he returned to the House of Representatives to represent Massachusetts. And he liked that better than being president.
I bet.
So she did an excellent job.
Mm.
Um,
What a legacy.
yes, it was an incredible legacy. The wife of one president who basically made sure that farm continued to make money during the revolution,
Mm.
um, and helped to reestablish their finances after they lost all the money in 1803. Um,
And if she weren't such a writer, a correspondent, a lot of that history would be lost.
Oh, yeah.
that's right.
I mean, praise God for the writing that she to everybody, her siblings. I mean, it's just amazing to me that you can construct with the kind of depth and breadth that you have from letters.
Yeah, everything we know from their letters. And you can read their letters. The letters between John and Abigail have been collected. They are available if you want them, if you want to see them. I think there's probably a book or of one or two volumes out that is just their letters to each other.
Oh,
Mhm.
amazing.
Plus, the archive has uh, more letters that the ones for her sisters, the ones she wrote to her children, and so forth. Yeah.
Many of her letters appear in a shortened form or more of a condensed form in David McCullough's book
Oh,
of
right.
Adams.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he was
That
very strong in praising her.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I was going to point out is that she had to lead a very different life than the next, well, from Martha and the next few presidents, because the rest of them were all from Virginia and they were much more wealthy, except for Jefferson. Jefferson, you never knew how much money he had, but the rest of them were much more wealthy and than what the Adamses were.
Mhm.
In many ways, they were land wealthy, um, but sometimes they didn't have a lot of cash on hand.
right, right.
And Jefferson kept meticulous books of everything he spent and everything that came in, but Jefferson never added them up at the end of the year and figured out if he made or lost money. And he usually lost money. Um, as I explained to some people at one point in time, Jefferson would have had every credit card out there and they all would have been maxed. Yeah. But Abigail, she grew up in New England. She knew frugality. She was a minister's daughter. She had to make do. And she had to provide for a lot of people in the community. And that's what her mother taught her to do. And she continued to do it as an adult.
Hmm. He appeared to appreciate that, and I wonder how many men at that time would have left the presidency or the House to go be with them while they recovered. I mean, I think that's you see lots of indications of his of their equality and his appreciation of what she'd done.
He was devoted to her. He was devastated when she died. And you do need to remember that the president and the government wasn't doing as much then as it is doing now. In fact, I think Congress was in session for maybe 3 months out of the year. So even though he was criticized for going to Quincy, he he could do a lot of it through letters um, back to his agencies and with his staff back in Washington. Um, there wasn't really that much to do compared to what it is like now. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate the organization and your presentation, the breadth and depth. I really appreciate your presentation.
Well, I appreciated my sources. Uh, Joseph Ellis is a noted revolutionary historian. Paul Nagel wrote a biography that was called The Adams Women. It was about two-thirds of it dealt with Abigail, and the final third dealt with Louisa Catherine. And Cokie Roberts,
Oh, marvelous book.
yeah, Founding Mothers, absolutely wonderful book.
A must read.
Yes, if you haven't read Founding Mothers, you have to do so. Not only Abigail, but she includes, I think, Elizabeth Pinckney and Deborah Franklin. Several of them uh, are in that book. And you might come away thinking that Benjamin Franklin was not such a good dude.
You might.
He he basically ignored Deborah and left her to run his affairs in Philadelphia for 20 years.
Mhm.
Um,
You didn't
so
walk away thinking he. I guess that's what the comparison is
mhm,
staunch
yeah,
because Benjamin Franklin did not in any way, in my opinion, appreciate, support, uh, do a cooperative kind of a situation. And I'm not even sure that he worked to keep any money flowing in there, like sending the souvenirs or whatever your term for them was from France.
knickknacks from France that
Nick,
she could sell. Things like, pins and fans, uh, they help bring money in because he wasn't making much. He was working, and none of those people on the Continental Congress were paid.
that's service, isn't it?
Huh?
That's public service.
That is true public service.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, he stood by her, he supported her, he did what he could to help the family from where he was. And she managed it all incredibly well.
Yes.
Yeah. And if you haven't read McCullough's book on John Adams, do so. Yeah. If there anything else,
No, thank you very much.
thank you for coming and attending and listening to my spiel on Abigail. I thought she was a fascinating woman.
Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Janet. Round of applause.
You're welcome. Enjoy the rest of your presentations.